February 1st, 1979, Mehrabad Airport, Tehran. A cold grey morning hangs over the run as the Air France Boeing 747 slowly rolls to a stop. The crowd outside the airport stretches for miles, an ocean of bodies, filling every road leading into Tehran. Men climb onto rooftops and traffic lights. Women wave black chadors in the air. Some hold photographs of a stern, bearded cleric whose name has already become legend, Ayatollah Khomeini. For 14 years he has lived in exile, first in Iraq, then in a quiet suburb outside Paris. Yet during those years his voice has traveled across Iran through cassette tapes, sermons copied and distributed in secret, and whispered conversations in mosques and bazaars. Now he is back. As the aircraft door opens, the revolutionary atmosphere becomes electric. Cameras flash, journalists push forward. Armed guards struggle to maintain a corridor through the swelling crowd. Inside the plane, Khomeini sits calmly, his expression almost unreadable. At 76 years old, he carries himself with the quiet authority of a man who believes history has already chosen him. When he steps onto the staircase, the roar of hundreds of thousands rises like thunder across the city. Iran's monarchy is collapsing. For decades, the country had been ruled by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. His government had built a powerful alliance with the United States, modernized the economy, and created a strong military. But beneath the surface, resentment had been growing. Many Iranians saw the Shah's rule as authoritarian, corrupt, and dependent on foreign influence. Religious leaders believed Western culture was eroding Islamic traditions. Political activists opposed the Shah's secret police, Savak, whose prisons were filled with dissidents. Through the late 1970s, protests spread across the country. Demonstrations in cities like Qom, Tabriz, and Tehran grew larger and more violent. Strikes shut down factories and oil fields. The government responded with force, but every attempt to restore control only intensified the uprising. By January 1979, the Shah had fled the country. The revolution was now unstoppable. But revolutions do not simply remove power. They replace it. And standing at the center of that replacement was the man stepping down the staircase at Mehrabad Airport, Ruhollah Khomeini. Within days, he would begin shaping a new political system unlike anything the modern world had seen. A state where religious authority and political power would merge. A system where the ultimate power would not belong to a president, parliament, or military commander. It would belong to a supreme leader. At the time, few outside Iran fully understood what that meant. The revolutionary government that emerged in 1979 created new institutions. There would still be elections. There would still be a parliament known as the Majlis. There would still be a president. But above them all stood a figure whose authority came not from voters, but from religious legitimacy. This concept was called Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. In Khomeini's vision, an Islamic scholar with deep religious authority would oversee the entire political system to ensure that government remained faithful to Islamic law and revolutionary principles. It was a radical fusion of theology and state power, and it meant that Iran's most powerful leader would not be chosen by democratic election. He would be chosen by religious scholars. For the first decade of the Islamic Republic, that leader was Khomeini himself. He commanded immense loyalty from millions of Iranians who viewed him not only as a political figure, but as a spiritual guide. His authority shaped every major decision of the new state. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, it was Khomeini who mobilized the country for what he called a sacred defense. Young volunteers joined the Basij militia. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps expanded into a powerful military institution. Meanwhile, the new government eliminated rival political factions. Leftist groups were crushed. Monarchists were exiled or imprisoned. Moderate revolutionaries who had initially supported the uprising found themselves pushed aside. The revolution was consolidating, and the supreme leader stood above all of it. But by the late 1980s, a new question quietly began to emerge within Iran's political elite. Khomeini was aging, his health was declining, and the Islamic Republic had been built around his personal authority. What would happen when he was gone? The answer to that question would shape the future of Iran for decades. Because waiting within the revolutionary establishment was a cleric who had quietly risen through the ranks of the new system. He had fought in the revolution. He had survived assassination attempts. He had built alliances within Iran's most powerful institutions. And when the moment came in 1989, he would become one of the most influential political figures in the Middle East. His name was Ali Khamenei. Few observers at the time predicted just how much power he would accumulate, or how deeply his decisions would shape Iran's relationship with the world. Over the next 3 decades, the office of Supreme Leader would evolve into one of the most powerful positions in global geopolitics. A role controlling the military intelligence services, judiciary, and ideological direction of an entire nation. But that transformation did not happen overnight. It began with uncertainty. Behind closed doors in Tehran, Iran's revolutionary leadership was already debating the future. Because when Ayatollah Khomeini finally died in June 1989, the question was no longer theoretical. The Islamic Republic needed a new supreme leader, and the man who would take that position would redefine the meaning of power inside Iran. June 3, 1989. Tehran, Iran. Inside a heavily guarded hospital room, senior officials of the Islamic Republic gather in silence. The atmosphere is tense and somber. Doctors move quietly around the bed where Ayatollah Khomeini lies in his final hours. Outside the building, security forces tighten their perimeter as word begins to spread through the capital. The founder of the Islamic Republic is dying. For 10 years, Khomeini has been the unquestioned center of Iran's political system. His authority has overshadowed every institution created after the revolution. Presidents have come and gone. Parliament has debated policies. Military commanders have fought wars. But above them all stood one man whose religious legitimacy and revolutionary prestige kept the entire system balanced. Now that balance is about to disappear. Within hours of Khomeini's death, Tehran begins preparing for one of the largest funerals in modern history. Millions will eventually flood the streets to mourn the man many still call Imam. Yet inside the government, another reality is unfolding. A leadership vacuum. According to Iran's constitution, the supreme leader must be chosen by the Assembly of Experts. This body of clerics holds the formal authority to select and supervise the highest authority of the Islamic Republic. But the constitution also contains a problem. The supreme leader is supposed to be a marja, one of the highest-ranking Shiite religious authorities in the world. Few people in Iran meet that qualification, and none of the obvious candidates possess the same revolutionary prestige as Khomeini. Inside Tehran's political elite debate begins almost immediately. One option is a leadership council made up of several clerics sharing the role. Another is to elevate a single successor who may not fully meet the traditional religious criteria. Behind closed doors, one name begins circulating more frequently: Ali Khamenei. At the time, he is serving as the president of Iran. He has held the office since 1981, navigating the country through the brutal years of the Iran-Iraq War. His political reputation is strong among revolutionary institutions, especially within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. But there is a problem. Khamenei is not a senior religious scholar. Compared to many clerics in the Assembly of Experts, his theological credentials are modest. In the traditional hierarchy of Shiite scholarship, he is far from the top. For the role envisioned in the Constitution, he does not appear to qualify. Yet politics rarely follows strict theological rules. Inside the Assembly of Experts meeting on June 4th, discussions intensify. One figure emerges as the key power broker of the moment: Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. A veteran revolutionary leader and influential political strategist, Rafsanjani understands the fragile balance of Iran's post-revolutionary system. The military institutions must remain loyal. The clerical establishment must accept the decision, and the new leader must maintain the revolutionary ideology that defines the Islamic Republic. During the meeting, Rafsanjani addresses the assembly. He recounts a conversation he claims to have had with Khomeini before his death. According to Rafsanjani, the founder of the revolution had privately indicated that Ali Khamenei could serve as supreme leader. Whether every member of the assembly fully believes this account is unclear, but the political logic begins to take hold. Khamenei is a revolutionary insider. He has survived an assassination attempt that left his right arm partially paralyzed, strengthening his image as a loyal servant of the revolution. He maintains close relationships with the Revolutionary Guard and security institutions. And unlike more senior clerics, he has experience operating within the state's political structure. Gradually, the momentum shifts. The assembly of experts votes. Ali Khamenei is chosen as the new supreme leader of Iran. At the time, even some insiders view the decision as temporary. His authority appears limited compared to the towering influence Khomeini once held. But in the years that follow, something unexpected begins to happen. Instead of remaining a symbolic figure, Khamenei quietly starts reshaping the entire structure of power around him. One of the first steps comes with a constitutional revision later in 1989. The requirement that the supreme leader be a marja is removed. The position becomes more flexible. And that change removes the most serious challenge to Khamenei's legitimacy. Meanwhile, new alliances are forming inside Iran's political system. The Revolutionary Guard, which expanded rapidly during the Iran-Iraq War, is transforming into a powerful institution that extends far beyond the battlefield. It begins building influence in intelligence industry and politics. Khamenei recognizes the strategic value of this relationship. While presidents will change and political factions will compete in elections, the supreme leader will maintain direct authority over the armed forces, the Revolutionary Guard, and the country's intelligence networks. These institutions become the backbone of his power. At the same time, Khamenei carefully strengthens ideological control. The supreme leader appoints the head of the judiciary. He influences the Guardian Council, a body that reviews laws and vets candidates for elections. He oversees the powerful state broadcasting organization that shapes Iran's national narrative. Piece by piece, the system consolidates. Many observers outside Iran still see the presidency as the most visible political office. Leaders like Akbar Hashemi, Rafsanjani, Mohammad Khatami, and later Mahmoud Ahmadinejad will dominate headlines. But behind the scenes, the ultimate authority is shifting elsewhere, to the office of the supreme leader, and Ali Khamenei is learning how to wield it. By the early 1990s, it becomes clear that the quiet cleric chosen during a moment of uncertainty is not merely a caretaker of Khomeini's legacy. He is building his own, and that legacy will shape Iran's domestic politics, its regional strategy, and its confrontation with global powers for decades to come. Early 1990. Tehran, Iran. Inside the office of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei studies reports arriving from every corner of the Islamic Republic. Intelligence briefings from the Revolutionary Guard, economic updates from government ministries, political assessments from clerical advisors. The papers covering his desk reflect the complex reality of a country emerging from revolution and war. Iran is exhausted. 8 years of brutal conflict with Iraq have drained the economy, devastated border regions, and left hundreds of thousands dead. Cities like Khorramshahr and Abadan still bear the scars of bombardment. Oil infrastructure needs rebuilding. Factories struggle with shortages. Inflation creeps upward. But the war has also produced something else. Powerful institutions forged in conflict. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, once a loose network of revolutionary militias, has transformed into a disciplined military organization with deep ideological loyalty to the Islamic Republic. The Basij volunteer forces remain embedded across Iranian society, connecting mosques, neighborhoods, and state institutions. Ali Khamenei understands that these organizations will be essential to the future stability of the system. Unlike Ayatollah Khomeini, whose religious authority alone commanded mass devotion, Khamenei must construct legitimacy through institutions and alliances. He moves carefully, strengthening relationships with the Revolutionary Guard leadership while expanding the role of security organizations in protecting the revolutionary order. At the same time, the presidency is now held by Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. Rafsanjani launches an ambitious reconstruction program aimed at rebuilding Iran's economy after the war. Infrastructure projects expand across the country. Highways, dams, and industrial zones begin appearing as the government tries to reconnect Iran to global markets. Rafsanjani represents a pragmatic vision of the Islamic Republic. He believes Iran must balance revolutionary ideology with economic development. But even as the president pursues modernization, the supreme leader ensures that political boundaries remain clear. Certain principles cannot be questioned. The Islamic Republic must remain resistant to Western influence. The revolutionary ideology of 1979 must be preserved, and ultimate authority must remain centered in the office of the supreme leader. To enforce these boundaries, several key institutions operate within the political system. One of the most powerful is the Guardian Council. This body of clerics and legal experts reviews legislation passed by Parliament. If a law contradicts Islamic principles or the Constitution, the Council can block it. It also controls which candidates are allowed to run in national elections. The result is a unique political structure. Elections exist. Political debates occur. But the range of acceptable viewpoints remains carefully defined. Above these institutions stands the supreme leader whose influence shapes every major strategic decision. Khamenei also begins expanding Iran. The experience of the Iran-Iraq War has convinced many leaders in Tehran that Iran must never again fight alone against powerful enemies. To prevent isolation, Iran gradually builds relationships with non-state actors across the Middle East. One of the earliest and most important alliances forms in Lebanon. During the 1980s, Iran had helped establish Hezbollah, a Shiite militant movement created to resist Israeli forces occupying southern Lebanon. By the early 1990s, Hezbollah is evolving into a powerful political and military organization with deep ties to Tehran. Through financial support, military training, and ideological guidance, Iran builds influence far beyond its borders. This strategy becomes known as the axis of resistance. It is designed to counter American influence, Israeli military power, and regional rivals such as Saudi Arabia. Inside Iran, however, new tensions are emerging. Many younger Iranians have grown up during the revolution and war. They now want greater cultural openness, economic opportunity, and engagement with the outside world. These demands will soon reshape Iran's internal political debates. By the mid-1990s, reformist intellectuals and clerics begin advocating a different vision for the Islamic Republic. They argue that Islam and democracy can coexist more openly. They call for civil society, freer press, and improved relations with Europe and the United States. The movement gains momentum, and in 1997, the political landscape of Iran shifts dramatically when a relatively unknown cleric named Mohammad Khatami runs for president. His campaign emphasizes dialogue between civilizations, cultural openness, and political reform. Millions of young voters flood polling stations. The result shocks the conservative establishment. Khatami wins in a landslide. For the first time since the revolution, reformist energy sweeps through Iran's political institutions. New newspapers appear. Universities become centers of debate. Civil society organizations expand. But this reform movement soon runs into the invisible boundaries of Iran's power structure. Because while the president controls the government, he does not control the entire system. The judiciary remains under the authority of the supreme leader. The Revolutionary Guard answers directly to him. The Guardian Council retains the power to block legislation and disqualify candidates. Ali Khamenei watches the reform movement carefully. He allows limited political experimentation, but he also signals that certain red lines cannot be crossed. Criticism of the Islamic Republic's foundations, challenges to clerical authority, or attempts to weaken revolutionary institutions. By the late 1990s, these tensions erupt into open confrontation between reformists and conservatives within the system. Student protests shake Tehran's universities. Newspapers are shut down by court orders. Security forces move quickly to contain unrest. For many Iranians, it becomes clear that while elections can shape policy, the deepest structures of power remain elsewhere. In the office of the supreme leader, and Ali Khamenei is steadily strengthening that position. The quiet cleric, once viewed as a compromise choice, is now transforming the role into something far more powerful than many originally expected. July 8, 1999. Tehran University. Tehran. Night has fallen over the campus, but the dormitory courtyards are still alive with voices. Students cluster in small groups beneath dim streetlights, discussing politics reform and the future of the Islamic Republic. Newspapers lie scattered across tables, their headlines filled with arguments about democracy, civil rights, and the meaning of the revolution 20 years after it began. The reform movement has awakened a generation. For 2 years, President Mohammad Khatami's victory has created an atmosphere unlike anything Iran has seen since the early days of the revolution. Young Iranians speak more openly about politics. Intellectuals debate the compatibility of Islam and democracy. Reformist newspapers challenge conservative institutions with articles questioning the limits of political power. But that summer night, the fragile experiment collides with the reality of the Islamic Republic's deeper power structure. Earlier in the day, authorities shut down a reformist newspaper accused of criticizing the security services. Students gather to protest the closure. What begins as a peaceful demonstration soon grows into something larger. By midnight, the chanting echoes across the campus. Democracy, freedom of the press, political reform. The slogans spread through Tehran's student population. Then the security forces arrive. Units of police and plainclothes agents move into the dormitories. Windows shatter. Doors are kicked open. Students are beaten and dragged into the streets. Some leap from upper floors to escape the violence. By morning, the university campus looks like a battlefield. The student protests of July 1999 quickly spread across Tehran and several other cities. For several days, young demonstrators challenged the authorities in the largest unrest Iran has seen since the revolution. For President Khatami, the crisis is devastating. He had promised reform within the framework of the Islamic Republic. He believed the system could gradually evolve toward greater political openness. But the institutions beyond his control move quickly to contain the unrest. The judiciary arrests activists. Security forces restore order. Reformist newspapers face new restrictions. Behind the scenes, the supreme leader delivers a message that leaves little room for ambiguity. Ali Khamenei publicly condemns the protests as threats to national stability and revolutionary values. In speeches broadcast across the country, he warns that enemies of the Islamic Republic are trying to exploit internal divisions. For Khamenei, the lesson of the revolution remains clear. Political instability can destroy a nation. Foreign powers will always seek to influence Iran's internal conflicts. And preserving the Islamic Republic requires maintaining strict control over the system's core institutions. The events of 1999 mark a turning point. The reform movement does not disappear, but its ambitions become constrained. Many reformist politicians remain active within Iran's political structure, yet they increasingly understand that real change cannot occur without confronting the deeper architecture of power. That architecture leads back to the office of the supreme leader. Through the early 2000s, Khamenei continues strengthening relationships with the institutions most loyal to him. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps expands its economic influence, gaining contracts in construction energy and telecommunications. The Guard's political influence grows as former commanders move into government positions. Meanwhile, the Basij network remains deeply embedded across Iranian society, connecting religious institutions, neighborhoods, and universities. Together, these organizations form a powerful protective structure around the revolutionary system. But while internal politics dominate the headlines inside Iran, events beyond the country's borders are about to reshape its strategic environment. September 11, 2001, New York City. 2 hijacked airplanes strike the towers of the World Trade Center. A third crashes into the Pentagon. Nearly 3,000 people are killed in coordinated attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda. The United States responds with overwhelming force. Within weeks, American military forces invade Afghanistan, overthrowing the Taliban government that had sheltered the attackers. 2 years later, the United States launches another war. March 2003. Iraq. American forces cross the border and begin an invasion aimed at removing Saddam Hussein from power. For Iran's leadership, these events create both opportunity and danger. Saddam Hussein had been Iran's most bitter enemy during the Iran-Iraq War. His removal eliminates a major regional threat. But the presence of large American military forces on Iran's eastern and western borders creates a new strategic reality. Iran is suddenly surrounded by United States troops. Inside Tehran, the supreme leader watches these developments carefully. Ali Khamenei believes the United States ultimately seeks to weaken or overthrow the Islamic Republic. His speeches increasingly frame the conflict as a broader struggle between Iran's revolutionary independence and Western political influence. In Washington, some policymakers begin discussing similar ideas from the opposite direction. The administration of President George W. Bush includes Iran in what it calls the axis of evil, accusing Tehran of supporting terrorism and pursuing nuclear weapons. The confrontation between the two countries begins escalating, and at the center of Iran's response stands the supreme leader. Over the next 2 decades, Ali Khamenei will guide Iran through sanctions, regional conflicts, nuclear negotiations, and shifting alliances across the Middle East. The cleric who once seemed an unlikely successor is now firmly established as one of the most powerful figures in the region, and the geopolitical consequences of his decisions are only beginning to unfold. August 14, 2002, Washington, D.C. Inside a conference room at the National Press Club, a group of Iranian opposition figures revealed documents that immediately attract the attention of Western intelligence agencies. The materials describe previously undisclosed nuclear facilities inside Iran. One location is near the desert city of Natanz. Another is at Arak. Within hours, the story spreads across international news networks. Satellite images begin circulating among diplomats and analysts. The images show large construction sites, high security fencing, and industrial structures unlike anything previously declared in Iran's nuclear program. The revelation triggers alarm across world capitals. For years, Iran had insisted its nuclear program was purely peaceful, focused on energy production and scientific research. But the newly exposed facilities raise a different possibility: uranium enrichment, a technology that can power nuclear reactors, but also potentially produce the material needed for nuclear weapons. In Tehran, the leadership gathers to assess the situation. For Ali Khamenei, the nuclear issue is not simply about technology. It is about sovereignty, national pride, and strategic deterrence. Iran's leadership has long studied the fates of other countries that confronted Western power. The examples are discussed frequently in private strategic circles. Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. Both regimes had faced confrontation with the United States. Both eventually collapsed. To Khamenei, the lesson appears clear. A nation must possess enough strategic leverage to prevent foreign domination. Iran's nuclear program becomes intertwined with that idea. Officially, the government insists its intentions are peaceful. Iranian officials argue that, as a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran has the legal right to enrich uranium for civilian energy purposes. But international suspicion grows rapidly. European governments open negotiations hoping to prevent escalation. Diplomats from Britain, France, and Germany travel repeatedly to Tehran, seeking a compromise that would limit Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for economic cooperation. Inside Iran's political system, debates unfold between pragmatic negotiators and hardline conservatives. Yet one figure ultimately sets the strategic boundaries: the supreme leader. Ali Khamenei does not participate directly in every diplomatic meeting, but no major decision proceeds without his approval. Iranian negotiators operate within guidelines established by his office. Those guidelines reflect a careful balancing act. Iran must avoid provoking military confrontation, but it must also preserve technological progress and national independence. The nuclear issue becomes a defining geopolitical struggle. Meanwhile, beyond the nuclear dispute, Iran's regional influence is expanding in ways few predicted a decade earlier. The American invasion of Iraq in 2003 removes Saddam Hussein, but it also transforms Iraq's internal power structure. For the first time in modern Iraqi history, the country's Shiite majority gains dominant political influence. Many Iraqi Shiite parties maintain long-standing relationships with Tehran. Iranian advisors, intelligence networks, and religious institutions begin quietly strengthening those connections. Over time, militia groups emerge with ideological and logistical ties to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The strategic map of the Middle East begins shifting. Iran is no longer isolated. It is building influence across a network stretching from Tehran through Baghdad to Damascus and Beirut. The architect behind much of this strategy operates within the Revolutionary Guard. His name is Qasem Soleimani. As commander of the Quds Force, the External Operations Division of the Revolutionary Guard, Soleimani becomes one of the most influential military figures in the region. His mission is to expand Iran's alliances with non-state actors capable of challenging Western and Israeli power. Hezbollah in Lebanon grows stronger. Shiite militias in Iraq become organized and well-armed. Relationships develop with the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. Behind these developments stands the strategic vision endorsed by the supreme leader. Khamenei rarely appears on battlefields or diplomatic front lines. Instead, he shapes the long-term direction of Iran's geopolitical posture. Resist Western pressure, expand regional alliances, preserve the revolutionary ideology. But by the late 2000s, tensions inside Iran itself begin rising once again. This time, the catalyst is not a student protest or newspaper closure. It is a presidential election. June 12, 2009, Tehran. Millions of Iranians go to the polls in a contest that pits incumbent President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad against several challengers promising political reform. When the results are announced, the government declares Ahmadinejad the overwhelming winner. But within hours, accusations of fraud begin spreading across the country. Crowds fill the streets. Green banners appear across Tehran. Chants echo through the night. Where is my vote? What follows becomes the largest political crisis Iran has faced since the revolution. And once again, the decisive response will come from the office of the supreme leader. Ali Khamenei now faces a test that will reveal how firmly he is prepared to defend the system he has spent 2 decades consolidating. June 19, 2009. Tehran University. Tehran. The courtyard is filled long before the supreme leader arrives. Tens of thousands gather under the intense summer heat, standing shoulder to shoulder across the campus. Loudspeakers echo through the crowd. State television cameras are already broadcasting live across the country. Iran is in crisis. 1 week earlier, the presidential election results had triggered something unprecedented since the revolution of 1979. Millions of Iranians poured into the streets of Tehran and other major cities wearing green ribbons and carrying posters of opposition candidates. They marched silently at first. Students, office workers, families with children, elderly, veterans of the revolution. The slogans were simple: "Where is my vote?" The movement quickly became known as the Green Movement, named after the campaign color of opposition candidate Mir Hossein Mousavi. For days, Tehran had become the center of a political confrontation between protesters demanding accountability and the state institutions determined to preserve order. Now the supreme leader is about to speak. Ali Khamenei walks slowly to the podium inside Tehran University. His black turban marks him as a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, a symbol of religious legitimacy and Shiite tradition. The crowd listens in silence. Across the country, millions watch on television. Khamenei's message leaves little ambiguity. He declares that the election results are valid. He warns that continued protests threaten the stability of the Islamic Republic, and he makes it clear that the state will not tolerate unrest that challenges the authority of the system. The speech draws a clear line. Political debate is acceptable, but public rebellion against the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic is not. Within hours, security forces move decisively. Units of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Basij militia deploy across Tehran. Demonstrations are dispersed. Activists are arrested. Opposition leaders find their movements restricted. Images of the protests spread across the internet, including videos recorded on mobile phones that reach audiences around the world. One clip showing the death of a young protester named Neda Aga Sultan becomes a symbol of the unrest. Inside Iran, however, the state maintains control. Over the following months, the Green Movement gradually loses momentum under the pressure of arrests, trials, and security operations. For Ali Khamenei, the crisis reinforces several core beliefs. The Islamic Republic must never allow internal divisions to weaken the system. Foreign powers will attempt to exploit moments of instability, and the authority of the supreme leader must remain the final safeguard of the revolutionary state. Yet even as domestic tensions simmer, a far larger geopolitical storm is forming beyond Iran's borders. December 17, 2010. Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia. A young street vendor sets himself on fire after harassment by local authorities. The act ignites protests that soon topple Tunisia's government. Within months, similar uprisings spread across the Middle East. Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Syria. The wave of revolutions becomes known as the Arab Spring. For Iran's leadership, the regional upheaval presents both opportunity and danger. In Egypt, the fall of President Hosni Mubarak weakens a long-standing American ally. In Bahrain, protests by the Shiite majority challenge a monarchy closely aligned with Saudi Arabia. But in Syria, the situation becomes far more complicated. When demonstrations erupt against President Bashar al-Assad in 2011, the Syrian government responds with force. The unrest quickly escalates into a brutal civil war. For Iran, Syria is not just another country. It is a critical strategic ally. The Syrian government provides the land corridor connecting Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Losing Damascus would fracture the regional network Tehran has spent decades building. Inside Tehran's security councils, the decision becomes unavoidable. Iran will intervene. Advisors from the Revolutionary Guard travel to Syria. Hezbollah fighters cross the Lebanese border. Over time, thousands of militia members from across the region join the conflict. The war transforms Syria into one of the most complex battlefields of the 21st century. Russia eventually intervenes with air power. The United States supports certain rebel groups. Regional powers funnel weapons and money into competing factions. Through it all, Iran's strategy remains consistent. Preserve the Assad government, maintain the axis of resistance, expand regional deterrence against Israel and Western influence. Behind these decisions stands the supreme leader. Ali Khamenei rarely appears in public discussions about battlefield operations, yet his strategic approval guides Iran's long-term involvement. By the mid-2000s, Iran has become deeply embedded in conflicts stretching across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Its regional influence is larger than at any time since the revolution. But the growing confrontation with Western powers has also produced another front in the struggle: economic warfare. Sanctions targeting Iran's banking system and oil exports begin tightening around the country's economy. And soon another diplomatic battle will emerge. This one centered around Iran's nuclear program. July 14, 2015, Vienna, Austria. Inside the Palais Coburg Hotel, negotiators from 6 world powers sit across the table from Iranian diplomats after nearly 2 years of intense discussions. Papers are scattered across conference tables. Translators whisper in multiple languages. Outside, television crews from around the world wait for the announcement. The talks have lasted through sleepless nights, missed deadlines, and repeated threats of collapse. Now a breakthrough is finally within reach. The agreement is called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. Under its terms, Iran agrees to limit uranium enrichment, reduce its stockpile of nuclear material, and allow international inspections of key facilities. In exchange, many international economic sanctions will be lifted, allowing Iran to reconnect with global markets. For President Hassan Rouhani and his Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, the deal represents a diplomatic victory. Years of economic pressure have taken a heavy toll on Iran. Oil exports have fallen sharply. The national currency has lost significant value. Young Iranians struggle to find jobs. The nuclear agreement promises relief. Yet the most important approval for the deal does not come from the presidency or parliament. It comes from the supreme leader. Ali Khamenei has watched the negotiations carefully from Tehran. Publicly, he expresses skepticism toward the United States, reminding audiences that Washington has a long history of hostility toward the Islamic Republic. But privately, he allows the talks to proceed. Khamenei's strategy reflects the careful balancing act that has defined his leadership for decades. Iran must avoid surrendering its technological achievements. At the same time, it must prevent economic isolation from destabilizing the country. By allowing the nuclear agreement, the supreme leader signals that diplomacy can coexist with revolutionary resistance. In Tehran, celebrations erupt after the deal is announced. Many Iranians hope the agreement will bring economic growth and a gradual thaw in relations with the outside world. Airplanes from European companies begin returning to Iranian airports. Foreign business delegations explore new investments. Students discuss the possibility of cultural exchanges and international travel. For a brief moment, the atmosphere inside Iran feels optimistic. But geopolitical tensions rarely disappear so easily. Across the Middle East, rival powers view Iran's expanding influence with growing concern. Saudi Arabia sees Tehran as a strategic competitor for regional leadership. Israel warns that Iran's nuclear program still poses an existential threat. And inside the United States, political divisions over the agreement deepen. The JCPOA survives for several years, but its future remains uncertain. November 8, 2016. United States presidential election. Donald Trump wins the presidency after campaigning heavily against the nuclear deal. During the campaign, he repeatedly describes the agreement as one of the worst deals ever negotiated. In Tehran, officials immediately begin debating the consequences. Ali Khamenei remains cautious. His distrust of American intentions has always been central to his worldview. For years, he warned that Washington might abandon the agreement if political circumstances changed. Those warnings soon prove accurate. May 8, 2018. The United States announces its withdrawal from the nuclear deal. Sanctions are reimposed. Iran's banking system is again cut off from much of the international financial network. Oil exports fall sharply as companies fear secondary sanctions from Washington. The economic pressure returns with full force. Inside Iran, anger grows toward the United States, but also toward those who had hoped the agreement would transform the country's economic future. For Khamenei, the collapse of the deal reinforces his long-standing argument. Western powers cannot be trusted to honor commitments with the Islamic Republic. In response, Iran begins gradually reducing its compliance with the nuclear agreement's limits. Uranium enrichment increases again. Advanced centrifuges are installed at nuclear facilities. The confrontation enters a new phase. Meanwhile, tensions across the region escalate. Conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen intensify. Israeli airstrikes target Iranian positions in Syria. American and Iranian forces come dangerously close to direct confrontation. At the center of Iran's strategic decisions remains the supreme leader. Ali Khamenei has now led the Islamic Republic for more than 3 decades. Longer than the Shah ruled Iran. Longer than many world leaders remain in power. And the system built around his authority shows no sign of disappearing. But one dramatic event is about to reshape the balance of power in the region. January 3, 2020. A convoy leaves Baghdad International Airport. Inside one of the vehicles sits the man responsible for much of Iran's regional military strategy, Qasem Soleimani. Within minutes, American drones launch missiles. The explosion lights up the dark Iraqi night. And the consequences will ripple across the Middle East. January 3, 2020. Baghdad International Airport, Iraq. The convoy moves slowly along the airport road in the early hours before dawn. The air is cool and quiet, the kind of stillness that usually settles over Baghdad before sunrise. Inside one of the vehicles sits Major General Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's Quds force. For years he has traveled across the Middle East, coordinating alliances, advising militias, and shaping Iran's regional strategy. In Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, his influence has been immense. To many in Iran, he is a national hero. To Washington and its allies, he is one of the most dangerous architects of Iranian power. The convoy has barely cleared the airport perimeter when the drones strike. 2 missiles tear through the vehicles. Flames erupt across the road. Within seconds, the man who spent decades building Iran's network of regional influence is gone. News of the strike reaches Tehran within hours. Inside the office of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei receives confirmation that Soleimani has been killed by a United States drone strike authorized by President Donald Trump. The decision shocks the Iranian leadership. Never before has the United States directly targeted such a senior Iranian military commander. For Khamenei, the event represents more than the death of a trusted strategist. Soleimani had been one of the most effective instruments of Iran's regional policy. His operations had helped secure the Syrian government during the civil war and strengthened Iranian-aligned militias across Iraq. The assassination sends a message. Washington is willing to escalate. Across Iran, millions pour into the streets during the days that follow. Massive funeral processions move through cities including Ahvaz, Mashhad, Qom, and Tehran. Black banners hang from buildings. Crowds chant slogans against the United States. Standing before the mourners, Khamenei promises retaliation. But retaliation must be calculated. Iran cannot allow the assassination to go unanswered. At the same time, a full-scale war with the United States could devastate the country. Days later, Iran launches ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi military bases housing American troops. The The strikes cause significant damage but avoid large numbers of casualties. Analysts around the world recognize the move as a carefully calibrated response designed to demonstrate strength without triggering uncontrollable escalation. For a moment, the region appears to stand on the brink of open conflict. Yet both sides step back. Behind-the-scenes diplomatic channels quietly communicate limits neither government wishes to cross. Still, the assassination changes the strategic landscape. Without Soleimani, Iran's regional network must reorganize its command structure. The Quds force appoints a new leader, but few possess the same battlefield experience and personal relationships Soleimani had built over decades. Meanwhile, Iran continues expanding its missile program and strengthening alliances with militia groups across the Middle East. Khamenei's broader strategy remains unchanged: deterrence through asymmetric power. If Iran cannot match the conventional military strength of the United States or its regional rivals, it will rely on networks of allies, missile capabilities, and ideological influence. But as the confrontation with Washington intensifies, another challenge begins emerging inside Iran itself: economic pressure. American sanctions have reduced oil exports dramatically. Inflation rises. The national currency loses value. Everyday life becomes increasingly difficult for many Iranian families. Occasional protests break out across different cities, often focused on economic grievances rather than political ideology. For the supreme leader, these domestic pressures are deeply concerning. Maintaining internal stability becomes just as important as confronting external threats. And as the 2020s unfold, the question of the future quietly begins circulating once again within Iran's political system. Ali Khamenei is now one of the longest-serving leaders in the modern Middle East. He assumed power in 1989. More than 3 decades have passed. The institutions he strengthened now dominate Iran's political structure. The Revolutionary Guard has grown into one of the most powerful military and economic forces in the region. The office of the supreme leader stands firmly above all other branches of government. But time continues moving forward, and eventually the Islamic Republic will face the same question it confronted after the death of Ayatollah Khomeini. Who comes next? June 18, 2021. Tehran, Iran. Polling stations open across the country under the watchful eyes of election officials and security forces. Posters of presidential candidates hang in quiet streets, though the atmosphere feels noticeably different from the energetic elections of earlier decades. Many familiar political figures are absent. In the months leading up to the vote, Iran's Guardian Council has reviewed hundreds of potential candidates and approved only a small number to run. Among those excluded are several well-known reformist politicians and moderate conservatives who might have created a competitive race. The field now strongly favors one man, Ebrahim Raisi, a cleric who has spent decades within Iran's judicial system. Raisi currently serves as the head of the judiciary. He is closely aligned with conservative factions and enjoys strong support among institutions connected to the supreme leader. When the results are announced, Raisi wins the presidency. For outside observers, the election reveals something important about the political architecture of the Islamic Republic. Over the years, Iran's system has evolved into a structure where elections still occur, but the boundaries of acceptable political competition are carefully controlled. At the center of that structure remains the office of the supreme leader. Ali Khamenei's authority extends across multiple pillars of the state. The armed forces answer directly to him. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps operates under his command. The heads of the judiciary and state broadcasting organizations are appointed by his office. The Guardian Council, which supervises elections and reviews legislation, includes members selected directly or indirectly by the supreme leader. Through these mechanisms, the system ensures that while presidents and parliaments may change, the ideological direction of the Islamic Republic remains consistent. This structure has allowed Khamenei to maintain continuity through shifting political eras. He has overseen governments led by pragmatic conservatives like Rafsanjani, reformists such as Mohammad Khatami, hardline populists like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, moderates including Hassan Rouhani, and now the conservative administration of Ebrahim Raisi. Each presidency has brought different policies and political styles, but the underlying framework of authority has remained stable. Beyond Iran's borders, the regional network developed during Khamenei's leadership continues operating across multiple countries. In Lebanon, Hezbollah maintains a powerful political and military presence. In Iraq, militia groups aligned with Iran influence both security and politics. In Syria, Iranian forces and advisors help sustain the government of Bashar al-Assad after years of civil war. In Yemen, the Houthi movement confronts a coalition led by Saudi Arabia. Together, these relationships form what analysts often describe as Iran's strategic depth. Instead of relying solely on conventional military strength, Iran has built a system of alliances capable of projecting influence far beyond its own territory. For Khamenei, this strategy serves two purposes. It deters external attacks by creating multiple fronts of resistance, and it reinforces Iran's role as a central player in Middle Eastern geopolitics. Yet the future of this system now faces growing uncertainty. Economic pressure remains severe. Younger generations of Iranians often have different expectations than those who lived through the revolution and the Iran-Iraq War. And above all, the question of succession quietly returns to the political conversation. Ali Khamenei is now in his 80s. Within Iran's leadership circles, discussions occasionally surface about who might eventually assume the position of supreme leader. The selection process would again fall to the Assembly of Experts, the same body that chose Khamenei in 1989. But the stakes today are far greater. The Islamic Republic is no longer a newly formed revolutionary state. It is a regional power with complex institutions, global confrontations, and deep ideological divisions. The next supreme leader will inherit a system shaped by decades of Khamenei's leadership. A system built around centralized authority, revolutionary ideology, and strategic resistance to external pressure. But whether that system can endure another transition remains one of the most important, unanswered questions in Middle Eastern politics. And as Iran enters a new decade filled with geopolitical tension, economic uncertainty, and generational change, the legacy of its current supreme leader continues shaping every decision made in Tehran. September 16, 2022. Tehran, Iran. A young woman named Mahsa Amini collapses shortly after being detained by Iran's morality police. Within hours, news spreads across social media platforms and messaging networks. By the next day, crowds begin gathering outside hospitals and government buildings. The demonstrations spread quickly. At first, the protests focus on the circumstances surrounding Amini's death. But as days pass, the chants evolve into something broader. Young Iranians, many of whom have grown up under decades of sanctions, economic struggles, and social restrictions, begin voicing deeper frustrations. Women remove headscarves in public squares. Students march through university campuses. Demonstrations appear in dozens of cities. For the Islamic Republic, the protests represent another moment of internal tension in a system designed to resist instability. Security forces move to contain the unrest. Internet access is restricted in certain areas. Arrests increase as authorities attempt to regain control over the streets. Throughout the crisis, Ali Khamenei remains the central authority guiding the state's response. His speeches frame the protests as a mixture of legitimate grievances and foreign interference. The language echoes themes that have appeared repeatedly throughout his decades of leadership: national sovereignty, resistance against outside influence, protection of the revolutionary system. By this point, Khamenei has been supreme leader for more than 30 years, longer than any modern ruler of Iran, since the fall of the monarchy. Under his leadership, the office of supreme leader has evolved into the most powerful position in the country. It stands above presidents, parliaments, and political factions. It commands military forces, intelligence agencies, and vast economic networks tied to religious foundations and state institutions. Few political systems in the world combine religious authority and political power in such a centralized way. The supreme leader embodies both. He is not merely a political leader. He is the final interpreter of the revolution's ideological direction. And through that authority, Ali Khamenei has shaped Iran's role in global geopolitics. He has guided the country through wars, sanctions, diplomatic negotiations, and regional conflicts. He has overseen the rise of the Revolutionary Guard as a powerful military and economic institution. He has supported alliances stretching from Lebanon to Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. He has confronted American pressure while maintaining Iran's nuclear and missile programs. For supporters of the Islamic Republic, these achievements represent resilience. They argue that Iran has survived decades of external pressure without surrendering its independence. For critics, the same period represents political stagnation and lost opportunities for reform. They point to economic difficulties, restrictions on civil liberties, and the growing gap between the state and younger generations. These competing narratives define Iran's present. But the future will ultimately depend on a moment that has not yet arrived. The next transition of supreme leadership. When Ayatollah Ali Khamenei died in 1989, the Islamic Republic was only 10 years old. Its institutions were still forming. Many believed the revolution might not survive the loss of its founding leader. Instead, the system adapted. Ali Khamenei's rise transformed the office of supreme leader into a powerful command center, overseeing nearly every major institution of the state. Now, decades later, Iran faces a similar question. What happens when this era ends? Will the system smoothly produce another leader capable of maintaining balance between ideology, security forces, and political institutions? Or will the transition open new struggles over power and direction? Inside Tehran's political circles, these questions are rarely discussed publicly, but they remain present in the background of every major decision. Because the Islamic Republic was built around a revolutionary vision where religion and state power merge. And at the center of that structure stands the supreme leader. For more than 3 decades, that figure has been Ali Khamenei, a cleric who once seemed an unlikely successor to a revolutionary giant, yet who ultimately became one of the most influential political figures in the modern Middle East. The future of Iran may soon depend on how the system he shaped survives the moment when a new leader must rise to take his place. End.